Okay, given that we're two past the hour, why don't we get into things today? So, I'm Jackson Gaspari, the Director of Member Services for CPCNH, and I'll be moderating today's session. The purpose of this office hours is to provide a recap of the 2026 legislative session, and then there will also be some time dedicated to discussing some of the pertinent dockets and information coming out of the regulatory process. In terms of brief housekeeping, there will be a couple chances throughout the session for attendees to ask questions. Certainly, as things come up throughout, please feel free to use the chat feature. We'll be monitoring that as well and can take questions when appropriate through that mechanism, or feel free to raise your hand and we'll call on you at the right time. So getting into the agenda for what we'll actually be covering today. We're going to start with a mini panel discussing with our speakers some of the key takeaways from the legislative session. Then Deana Dennis will be leading a rundown of some of the legislation that was of importance to the coalition. Then will be an opportunity to really look ahead to what's upcoming in the 2027-2028 biennium. Then we're going to shift gears with a segment led by our executive director on the competitive landscape and regulatory updates, and hopefully have plenty of time at the end for Q&A. So in terms of today's speakers, we have Deana Dennis, who is our Director of Regulatory and Legislative Affairs for CPCNH. We're also joined by Andrew Provencher, our principal for Main Street Strategic, who helps us with our government affairs and our communications work. So, he's a key player in terms of our relationships in the State House, and appreciate him joining us. We have as well Clifton Below, who's our chair of our Regulatory and Legislative Affairs Committee. He is also the secretary for the board of directors. And like I mentioned, Henry will be hopping in later on, who is our executive director. Okay, so to start with some key takeaways from this session, I'm going to ask our panelists a number of questions. And for everyone who's on, namely, I'm looking at you, Deana, and you, Andrew, for now. What is your overall takeaway from the session?
Deana, do you want to start off here?
Sure, I'd love to. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome again, Deana Dennis, Director of Regulatory and Legislative Affairs for the Community Power Coalition. I'm just chuckling at the comment made in the chat about Cliff not aging a bit. I don't see him on now, but hopefully he'll be joining. If not, I think Andrew and I will carry the torch for him. And I'm not sure what's going on with the little drawings, but hey, I like it. So what is something that surprised me this legislative session? Well, going into the session, I was prepared for a lot worse, more frontal assault on energy, clean energy, local choice and control. And I think the outcome was actually a lot less bad going in, and hopefully Andrew and I can go into that. But just as a few examples, you may recall there was an attempt to repeal the local solar tax exemption, House Bill 1002. And then, by the grace of God, one of the Republican members from, I think, Stratford County made a motion to table. He had the votes to table it, and it died on the table. So that was kind of a big one. And I think this all goes back to the Republican majority's kind of view of energy and clean energy as seeing a need to cut out green pork. And I'm paraphrasing by something that Andrew had referred to it as that in the past. And then, we also had some attempts at reverting to monopoly market structures for energy generation and distributed energy. Some of those bills originally were a lot, bigger and worse, like letting utilities own 350 megawatt small modular nuclear reactors and such, and they ended up getting pared back. There's still concerns that we have over market competition and not a level playing field. We can get into those more, but that's really kind of the surprise for me was I thought, it could be a lot worse going in, and actually it wasn't as bad as I thought. So Andrew, over to you.
Yeah, I would say that the second part of the session is always interesting because you're dealing with more policy items. So the first half we had a budget. We saw in the budget that there were, certain areas that were I'd say kind of money was pulled from in regards to like renewable energy fund dollars. And I think we weren't really sure exactly what the posture of the legislature and the governor's office was going to be on some of these energy issues heading into this second session. And I agree with Deana. I thought in a lot of cases, cooler heads prevailed on some issues that we probably aren't very, fond of, whether it be the ownership of some of these utilities and them kind of almost in some ways like us reverting back to an old kind of lineage way of having our investor-owned utilities, have a more active role in electricity. So I think that we've been happy to see that there's been a block in the House of Republicans that have worked with the Democratic Party on some of these issues. The solar exemption is a good example. I think there's a big block of Republicans and Democrats in the Senate who have been pretty proactive on a lot of energy issues, and have kind of, I think, at time been at odds with House leadership, or the governor's office on some occasions. But as we saw through the committee of conference process, ultimately they were able to kind of come to some sort of agreement on a number of these issues. I think probably my biggest takeaway would be, and this kind of actually goes into kind of what we thought going into the session to what actually we ended up getting. But seeing a bill like 1733 and the reconciliation of default energy services and making sure that we're trying to get something in statute there to prevent those utilities from forcing under collections onto community power members and competitive suppliers. Just the way that issue has evolved in the last few years, from being something that really wasn't on the mind of any legislator to now being something that folks are kind of leading on and a charge that's growing there. So I think that these are a lot of issues that CPCNH has led the charge on bringing some of this to the legislature, and we're starting to see the legislature now put in place a law to kind of really work within that framework. So I think that's a positive thing to see. And I wasn't really sure going into the year, this second half, if we would have seen the outcome that we got out of that bill. It wasn't everything we wanted. It wasn't perfect. It didn't go far enough. But to get something out of that bill where, a year ago, dead on arrival in the House. So I think it's that's a positive sign that there's kind of a little bit of smoke behind the fire of some of these issues in the legislature.
Great. Yeah, thank you both. And expanding upon that, Andrew, I think you touched on this a bit. So maybe starting with you, Deana, what issue or outcome really played out differently than you maybe anticipated this session?
Yeah, I think just going back to the two bills that I think it's interesting, mostly the Republicans, so the Republican majorities in the House and the Senate have this view that because no new generation is getting built in the state, that it's an indicator that the market is failing and we need to revert back to utility monopoly ownership of generation. So I guess seeing how that debate evolved, and CPCNH jumped in opposing those bills again because of what we perceive as harmful impacts on the competitive market, and the fact that the same price signals that are available to the utilities to justify investments in these, distributed energy up to 5 megawatts, whether it's distributed solar storage or, now one of the bills, House Bill 1775, that's making its way to the governor's office, would include nuclear and natural gas up to 5 megawatts. So, we really helped shape the narrative of, I would say, eloquent opposition to that. I still don't think that everybody gets it or sees the problem in having an asymmetrical market where only one player, the utilities, have access to certain price signals, whereas other competitors like CPCNH does not have access to those price signals. So, and that just, ekes out any competition. So while the intention of these bills, Senate Bill 591, House Bill 1775, is to spur more investment and innovation in local homegrown distributed energy, including nukes and natural gas, the impact is likely, at least in the next few years, not really to spur any sort of deployment and development of these resources. So we still believe that our New Hampshire Energy Forward vision of enabling a local market within New Hampshire for distributed energy and storage resources, virtual power plants where they can compete on equal footing, have access to all the price signals and get paid based on their performance is still the right course for New Hampshire. We think it still aligns nicely with the New Hampshire Live Free or Die, the constitutional provisions, and a lot of the overarching policy principles in New Hampshire's energy statute.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much for that, Deana. Really insightful. And Andrew, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that question
No,
yourself.
no, probably the only thing that I would add is I think that it was nice to see us us as CPCNH having a number of bills that we were very passionate about from both proactive sense and making legislation and then a reactive sense and maybe being imposed to something else. And then to see those bills, make it through the process and be successful. So whether that be, Senate Bill 590 with the revolving funds, or whether it's 1718 and energy connection with net metering with storage, I think it's really nice to see concepts that were important to the membership get moved up, and then to have the committee go through its process and kind of finding sponsors, and then to go through the legislative process, and for those to be in a position to be signed by the governor and become law. So it's nice to get some wins and continue to kind of build credibility as a new organization, build credibility within the departments, and also building credibility within the elected officials as CPCNH being someone who should be at the table. And when they're talking about energy, they're going to want to hear from Deana or Cliff, and they're Henry. They're going to want to hear from folks at CPCNH and understand how it's impacting them. So that's a really great step forward, and I think we're on a good trajectory there.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And connected to some of what you were saying, Cliff, maybe I'll look to you. I see that you're on. What do you see looking back as the most significant energy policy development from the session?
Well, I think that the bill to very explicitly enable storage in conjunction with net metering is actually quite important, and not just, perhaps even more so than just for net metering. It clarifies the statute on energy storage 374H more, and sets should provide direction to DOE and the PUC that they not only need to allow storage in conjunction with net metering, but they need to enable net storage independently of net metering in sort of the broader limited producer concept, in a way that also needs to acknowledge its value in terms of avoided capacity cost and avoided transmission cost, which are part of the value stack that is key Paul Bemis is noting, it sets the stage for virtual power plants. Exactly. It's a fundamental building block and a policy direction that we want to enable, independently of net metering, for other third-party players to bring storage online that can capture the same value stack that each of the utilities in different PUC filings have claimed that they can realize themselves. in particular, avoided transmission is a huge piece that makes battery storage and demand response make sense. And also to get the avoided capacity cost, because a little known feature of that is a megawatt reduction on the demand side means that there's between 1.3 and 1.4 megawatts of capacity that you don't have to buy from the wholesale market when you function as a load reducer at coincident times. So that's what I think is the biggest one. And the fact that we ended up getting that bill out of committee into, on a unanimous vote. And I think it even passed on the consent calendar in the House. That was important.
Awesome. Yeah, and does that really indicate, Cliff or Dina, that we're seeing a renewed interest in distributed energy resources and battery storage within New Hampshire? Do you think that's indicative of, further progress in those areas to come?
I'll happy to jump in first. Yes, I do. And I think one of the silver linings in the session was the bipartisan support for the.
Oops, you muted, Dina.
Yes, so I see one of the silver linings was the broad bipartisan support for that bill Cliff mentioned, House Bill 1718. And before the session, there were some conversations with some of the legislators and stakeholders around even, looking a step further at VPPs, virtual power plants. And there was a separate bill on that. And initially it sounded like there was some Republican support for it. It didn't quite work out that way, but I do think that looking ahead to next year, building off of the bipartisanship that we were able to help forge on that bill is going to be helpful to advancing more of our priorities and in terms of this energy forward market vision next year.
Great. Do you have anything to add on that?
And I would say, one thing, there's a fair amount of turnover coming up with science, technology, and energy, particularly on the Republican side, with the chair and vice chair retiring and not running again. But even without them, there was some, they're more aware of the load reducer concept, and which is kind of why they focused on enabling utility to dabble in this in the under 5 megawatt realm. That they are sort of thinking of maybe micronuclear as a distributed energy resource. So there's a real, I think, opportunity to sort of try to bridge partisan lines. Assuming only some change in what the composition at the State House, in a way that even if Governor Ayotte is elected to another term, that there is the possibility of getting bipartisan support for developing or unleashing a state jurisdictional actual market for distributed energy resources, where entities other than the utility can be the off-takers of exports to the grid. That's sort of our core potential value proposition, that we could, communities could help develop distributed energy resources that can actually be used to satisfy the local community load, and get credit for the fact that you can do this without having to rely upon transmission capacity from power plants in other states. And in doing so, we free up capacity for other beneficial electrical growth across the region, and do it at lower cost than having to just build more capacity to meet peak demand without providing price signals to distributed energy resources to help do that at lower costs than building more transmission.
Yeah, a lot of opportunities to be had.
Absolutely. And playing off of those opportunities, I'll start with you, Cliff, and then maybe go to you, Andrew, to wrap up this portion of things. But looking ahead to next year, what's one of the key energy issues that CPCNH and its members should be paying close attention to in your mind?
Well, just what I said.
Yeah.
Uh, um, yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, the good news is on the regulatory front, key part of our strategy for a while has been to get to peel off one or more of the utilities from Eversource, because Eversource is the one that has thrown its weight around to block these initiatives for the past 4 or 5 years. And we'd succeeded in doing that with Unitil because, as part of a settlement in their distribution rate case, they agreed to move forward. I mean, they're already way ahead of the other utilities on AMI, and they're updating their AMI systems. And what they want to do is move towards using individual customer actual interval data for daily load settlement, which creates huge opportunities for folks like us to help add value to customers by improving their load shapes with behind the meter battery storage, for instance. But moreover, they're also in that process of looking at updated load settlement vendor. They also agreed that they would include in that a provision that they account for exports to the grid as offsets to the wholesale load requirements for each supplier. And that would be the huge change that we need. So, legislatively, the fact that one utility is saying, yeah, we think this is possible and we're going to go down this road, it sets the stage to push the other utilities. Liberty would already like to go down that road, but Eversource is the one that's most resistant. And that creates an opportunity when they're not all singing from the same song sheet to make progress, to realize that these are not crazy ideas we're talking about. They're common sense ideas, and they're ones that should appeal across the political spectrum.
Yeah, I'd say that I think kind of I agree with everything Cliff just said. I think from like a further 30,000 foot view, I think when I look at it, every elected official from every party is very concerned about electricity and electricity rates. And that's something that is goes through any sort of partisan, piece. And they hear it a lot from their constituents. And like any difficult issue. It's very complicated, and there's not a single bullet approach that is going to be a perfect fit. And that makes this issue even more complicated and difficult in a lot of ways. And I think that sometimes, as we've seen when it comes to like utility ownership and going back to monopoly days, I think that ends up being what some legislators see as a simple solution to a complex issue. But as the case was made years ago and is still being made now, that doesn't necessarily equate to better results. And I think that one of the benefits that we have is that our posture and our positioning is one of competition, which is something that makes a lot of sense in New Hampshire, which is a very purple state. And regardless of how election results move one way or the other, we have elections every couple of years, and you have a lot of people return or come back. So kind of investments you make on messaging with people is important and impactful for a long period of time. I think what's been interesting, what will be interesting in the next session too, is that there is a growing number of Republicans who are engaging on energy issues in a way that they haven't in the past. And for them, it involves nuclear energy or the small modulars. So I think that sometimes there's advantage in like meeting people where they are and finding ways to, if we're going to find different ways for DERs to bring investment or battery storage to bring investment, how do we work with them to build a framework that would allow for some of these advancements, but also make sure that it's it's fixing a structural system that's putting us in a better competitive a place moving forward. So having people being interested in the issue, even if they don't, even if folks on either party aren't, purely aligned with everything we want, finding ways that we can work with people and finding ways for us to help rebuild a more competitive New Hampshire electricity grid and energy supply and energy marketplace is critical to CPCNH really being able to optimize its work for its membership. So I think that it's when I look at it, there's just a ton of opportunity to work with a lot of folks we haven't always necessarily been able to work with, or and I think in that there's a lot of opportunity next session for continual advancements to build that kind of competitive place that we want to be operating in.
Great. Thank you all so much for your insights. I think it's really important dialogue. And now I'll turn it over to Deana to get more into the bills and the results of those bills from this past session. Go ahead, Deana.
Great. Thanks so much, Jackson. Thank you, Andrew and Cliff, for sharing your insights today. And I know you'll be staying on with us for a bit. Andrew may have to drop off in the next 15 minutes or so. So let's take a big picture look at what we were engaged on this year. So CPCNH monitored or engaged in some capacity on about 60 bills this session. And there were 15 bills that we supported. There were 6 bills that we opposed. There were a number of bills that we didn't support or oppose, but maybe we were supportive or opposed certain provisions of them. So we had a separate category this year of bills that we engaged in. I think there were about 10 of those bills, and then a number of bills that we just were monitoring because it didn't directly impact us or align with our legislative platform, but we wanted to stay abreast of the developments. So in terms of what the results are, so of those 15 bills that we supported, more than half of them, 8 of them, have gone to the governor's office. I know that she's signed at least one of them so far. Another 2 were referred to interim study. So that's not a bad thing, as it means that the concepts could come back, be introduced in next year's session. And then there were a number, mainly in House Science, Tech, and Energy Committee that were sponsored by Democrats that just, there wasn't the political desire and will to move them forward this year. But I think there's, some of them had some worthy concepts that, may come back in next year's session. And then turning to the bills that we opposed, again, 2 of them were the bills that would allow utilities to get back into the business of owning generation, storage, distributed energy, again, for market impact reasons, and we oppose them. There were a couple of other bills like House Bill 1002 that would have repealed the local solar tax exemption, and a few others. So all in all, not bad that, 2 of them died. One of them, there was non-concurred, and, 3 of them are looking like they're making their way to the governor. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to try to do this in the next 10 minutes or so, but I want to kind of run down our priority bills, which ones are still in play, still moving, making their way through the enrollment process through SOS, Secretary of State, or they're awaiting action by the governor. And then I want to open for some feedback and input from you all at the end of this section before we turn over to our regulatory and market update section. So one of our top priority bills this year, House Bill 1718, as Cliff mentioned, would enable battery storage with net metering, wide bipartisan support in both House and Senate. It made it through enrollment just earlier this week, and it's now headed to the governor's office. We have not received indications that the governor won't sign it. I think, and if Andrew can jump in if he has any more immediate intel to share.
Nothing immediate other than that. I've reached out to the governor's office with both these bills. They haven't expressed to me any particular concern they have, so they were either still in the process of reviewing, or I imagine we should be fine. But I'm on my list to check back in again, and hopefully we can have these things get signed.
Great, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so that brings us to the next bill, Senate Bill 590. It allows municipalities to utilize revolving funds to support their electric aggregation plans. Like a number of these communities have started or want to do in the future discretionary reserve adders so they can accrue some funds to then support local energy projects in their communities. So that bill also had wide bipartisan support in both chambers. It's headed to the governor's office. As Andrew mentioned, we've requested some sort of a bill signing ceremony with the governor, if she's going to be signing those into law. So we'll keep folks posted if there's an opportunity to engage there. Next, we have House Bill 1535. That is the infamous semicolon bill that I think was brought to the attention of legislators in the Upper Valley by our own Clifton Below. Makes an important clarification for landfill gas that it is eligible under New Hampshire RPS as a Class 1 resource. That also received bipartisan support, and it's headed to the governor's office. Senate Bill 538, it extends the eligibility term for municipal host net metering customer generators to 20 years. This bill, there was some ping pong. It was in another bill, Senate Bill 449, that was ITL'd in the House. It then got put into, I think, Senate Bill 221, which was a bill we were just monitoring from last year. And that came back, went to committee of conference, and then the governor vetoed it. So the concept of the 20-year eligibility term has moved around in several vehicles. Now it's back preserved in its original bill. And I just want to share in terms of how this would impact CPCNH. For instance, Poverty Plains would be able to net meter for 20 years instead of 14 and a half years. So it just gives that much surety that those type of generators between 1 and 5 megawatts get to participate in the net metering program. Let's go to the next slide, please. So next we have the plug-in solar bill, which seems to be everybody's favorite bill. There was a lot of back and forth about the safety requirements and how to regulate all of that. It was amended in the House to require compliance with national safety standards, and it's now on its way to the governor's office. House Bill 1742. This is a bill that would protect net metered customers that get inadvertently enrolled in community power aggregation programs. It provides protections by ensuring that they get restored back to utility default service within, I think, like 5 days. And then they're also able to receive retroactive credits for their exports for up to 4 months. That bill also had pretty bipartisan support and is on its way to the governor's office. And then a bill that wasn't a top priority, but we like to support things where they're aligned. And Senate Bill 440, it's a CPACER, so it's Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy and Resilience. This would kind of streamline or fast track the ability of municipalities to adopt clean energy and efficiency districts to have these programs instead of having to wait to do it annually at the town meeting. So that bill has made it through and is on its way to the governor's office. We'll go to the next slide. So there's some other bills still moving. As mentioned, the 2 utility ownership of generation, Senate Bill 591, House Bill 1775. They're both, well, the governor did sign Senate Bill 591 a couple of weeks ago. 1775 is headed to her desk. House Bill 1738. This was also subject of some ping pong in some other committees of conference. The original language is now back intact in the bill, and it's important because it ensures that New Hampshire doesn't lose the benefits from participating in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, program. And this was one that had broad bipartisan support, and particular support from Republicans. And the bottom line is New Hampshire would lose out on money if they did not continue with the program. So I think everybody thought, well, if we're going to prioritize affordability and lowering costs, we need to be prepared to eat our cake too. So this was one that they took for the team. And then Senate Bill 599, it's a bill we were monitoring. It fixes the Renewable Energy Fund raid. If you recall, last year through, I believe it was the budget trailer bill, House Bill 2, they had attempted to raid what was in the Renewable Energy Fund to transfer it to the general fund. But apparently they goofed when that happened. So this bill actually fixes an error in last year's bill. And It does allow the rate of the Renewable Energy Fund, but it leaves certain money for Department of Energy administrative costs. It leaves up to $1 million in the fund to support, clean energy projects. And then the rest goes to the general fund. That bill is going to the governor's office. We'll go to the next slide. I think there's two more. So these are just some of the bills that died in the House. You'll probably remember House Bill 1002, solar tax exemption repeal, strong opposition by the BIA. I think some of the businesses that weighed in before it went to the floor really helped push it over the edge. Clean Energy New Hampshire, NHMA, there, and us, of course, there was a big coalition of folks that were opposing this bill, and it died on the floor, on the House floor. House Bill 1542, this bill evolved from zeroing out the Renewable Energy Fund compliance payments to becoming a study committee. The Senate amended it that way, but ultimately the House did not concur with the Senate's version. House Bill 1721, that bill would have sunsetted the RPS. It was amended and sort of watered down in the House ST&E committee to leave classes 3 and 4 intact. Those are the biomass and small hydro resources, but it did ultimately die on the House floor. And then House Bill 1736, it repeals alternative rate making. And that was a bill that we engaged in, and we helped educate the committee so they could see that, there is potential value in exploring alternative regulatory and rate making options. And, the commission that tool shouldn't be taken away from the commission. And us and others also made similar arguments, and we're pleased to see the committee recommended that ITL, which is good. That was a bill that was supported by Department of Energy. And then the last bill on the slide, 1748, you all might remember it's the White Mountain Power Authority. This was kind of a way to take over energy efficiency New Hampshire saves and do nuclear, like long-term contracting, and by creating this not governmental, but sort of governmental agency to administer that. There was a lot of pushback by the energy efficiency community. It was strongly supported by DOE. Apparently DOE wrote the bill. But this House Science and Energy recommended interim study. They came back earlier this month to deal with it, and they ultimately recommended ITL as the final recommendation.
To be clear, it wasn't actually ITL. In the second year of the biennium, bills that are referred to interim study get a recommendation of either recommended for future legislation or not recommended for future legislation. So they voted this one unanimously, not recommended for future legislation. It doesn't prevent somebody from bringing it back in the next session, because it's just a recommendation. It doesn't really carry any weight or finality.
Thank you for that clarification. That is an error on my part, and we will fix the slides before we share them. Yes,
it's a little confusing.
There is some nuance to it, but yeah, Cliff's right. The recommendation was not recommending for future legislation. Again, that doesn't stop anybody from bringing back the bill as was written, or some of the similar concepts into legislation next year. All right, we have one last slide to go on our bill rundown. So bills that died in the Senate. I mentioned earlier Senate Bill 449, that was the net metering expansion bill, up to 5 megawatts for commercial and industrial customers. It also included that 20-year eligibility term. Not surprisingly, when I got to the House just ITL'd it. That was the second attempt for that bill to come before them. And earlier in the session, I think they did some maneuver that was really judged it as ITL, meaning that if it ever came back again, it was almost guaranteed to get that recommendation. Also, a bill that died was Senate Bill 597, which was an interesting bill. We didn't oppose or support, but we did engage in it around performance-based rate making. It had some interesting concepts. It was referred to interim study. I don't believe the Senate has come back to deal with it yet, but there's some worthwhile concepts, and hopefully there will be vehicles for it to come back and for CPCNH to engage. Senate Bill 537, that's similar to the House Bill 1736, would have repealed alternative rate making. That was also ITL'd in the Senate. And then another small bill that we supported was Senate Bill 628 that would have enabled more streamlined EV curbside charging, and that was recommended for interim study. So with that, we'll go to the next slide. And I will mention that one bill that was signed into law earlier this week, even though it doesn't appear on the bill docket to have been signed, is House Bill 1733. I know Andrew mentioned it at the top, but this was the default service reform bill that we had introduced last year's session, and that bill died on the table. And we worked to get it back there, and we got some other stakeholders and suppliers and legislators to get behind it. The version that came out of the House was really good, was really strong, and then it got to the Senate, and the DOE and the PUC had done some behind the scenes advocacy to undermine it and impress upon the Senate that this bill wasn't really needed and should be watered down if it was going to pass at all. So sort of a compromise approach was they would retain the cost shift general prohibition, but they would allow this opt in the event of extraordinary circumstances that the commission could make a determination through an adjudicated proceeding. So it was a bill that ultimately we're supportive of because it does, the way it's structured in the statute, it helps to reinforce these other policy principles around default service and how default service should be administered. But we are very, remain vigilant and concerned about the bill's implementation, in particular with the current situation with Liberty's under collection and its default service. We'll get to that a little bit later. So we'll go next. So looking ahead to the next biennium, we can go to the next slide. I just wanted to maybe not now, but I want to just open it up to any feedback. What kind of opportunities do you see for progress in the next biennium? What priorities would you like to see CPCNH work on? Is there anything you'd like to see us do more of, less of, or differently? Definitely, you can use the chat or feel free to email any of us, Cliff, Jackson, Andrew, myself. We can set up time to chat. You could also think about attending the RLAC summer planning retreat coming up July 24th. But I do want to pause before we segue into the market and regulatory update section for any questions about the legislation, anything that we've discussed so far.
Deana, this is Paul. I hope you can hear me. How much money did they end up getting from the REF? How much did they take from it? 20 mil?
I don't know that. I'd have to come back unless somebody on the call knows. It was whatever was in there from last year plus now this current year.
I would have to double check the number. I'd say substantial, but I'll have to
in the millions.
My recollection is perhaps on the order of 3 to 5 million or something.
Oh, 3 to 5. Oh, 3 to 5. It's not 20, but that money is used for, New Hampshire Saves, isn't it?
No, it was used for different incentive programs to develop new renewable or distributed generation.
So solar, for example.
Yeah. Well, and they also had a competitive program for proposals other than just PV, and some of the wood energy, pellet boilers for schools and public buildings and stuff like that got funded through those competitive solicitations. But all that's kind of gone. They just use some now for administrative support. And all the rest on an annual basis getting redirected. The lump sum that was transferred might have been considerably bigger. I was probably thinking in terms of what goes in there perhaps annually from alternative compliance payments. But because DOE had not been spending the money, they let it build up. So the one-time sweep might have been larger.
Great, thank you. I don't see any other questions at this time, so maybe we can move to the next slide. And I think Henry Herndon is up. Henry, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Deana. Good afternoon, everyone. Um, I'm just going to briefly describe competitive landscape and regulatory updates, and really I'll focus on the expert witness testimony that Clifton and myself filed in the Eversource Energy Supply docket earlier this week, and also noting on the testimony that Deana and Clifton filed in the Liberty case. And I think we'll maybe move to the next slide. So folks likely received the statement we put out on this, sort of summarizing the issue. There's sort of come to light in recent months the persistent and significant divergence between utilities' advertised rates and the actual costs associated with their power supply, resulting in these large under-recoveries, approximately 50 million as of the end of April across the three utilities. And some of the important questions this raises for market design, competitive market design, and New Hampshire's energy policy objectives, our legislative energy policy objectives. And actually, before going to this slide, if whoever's controlling slides could go back to that 1733 slide, I just want to ground this in that. Yes, right here. So really the focus of our testimony in the Eversource case was unpacking whether or not the Eversource default service rate is consistent with state law, and specifically the law establishing default energy service as a stable backstop that does not defer costs or unduly harm the competitive market, and whether that rate that is set is just and reasonable. So I think we focus on the amended language here in the bold italics, but what is already in state law is this top part, which is important and relevant. This is where the policy principles for design of utility default supplier outlined, noting that as competitive markets develop, the Commission may approve these means of providing transition or default service that should be designed to minimize customer risk, not unduly harm the development of competitive markets, mitigate against price volatility without creating new deferred costs. So that is the framework, and that's some of the questions that are raised and then presented in these current dockets and some upcoming dockets. So again, sort of the broader question, are these rates just and reasonable? Do they comply with law? Is it just and reasonable for a distribution utility to persistently and significantly set an energy service rate, a non-monopoly service beneath the cost of that service when this is really a competitive market function? So some of the other questions that are sort of pending and that are provoked in these cases are how to recover these large undercollections. In the Eversource instance, for the past 3 periods or 18 months, they have undercollected each of those 3 periods. The running total balance is about 38 million. That may be slightly defrayed by some gains for the current and final 3 periods of this rate period. And then there's discussion of recovering a portion of that moving forward. And then another important question is, does the method in which the regulators are setting these utility supply rates, if it appears to structurally underprice the market, are there adjustments to that methodology, or are there alternatives to providing default service that are better aligned with state law and fair market competition? So our testimony addresses a lot of these questions. We summarize the outcomes, the market effects, the competitive implications of this in conjunction with the state policy objectives. And there are competing objectives, right? There's an objective to reduce costs, but also written into New Hampshire law is the objective to promote a free and fair competitive market, to promote customer choice, to enable local control and innovative local solutions to local needs, to empower things like municipal aggregation and community power. And of course, the law makes clear that electric generation is not a competitive service, but it is a competitive service. It is not a monopoly service. So some interesting notes on this as well. A year ago, CPCNH and another one of our expert witnesses did provide testimony and analysis, essentially looking at the method for setting these utility proxy rates and demonstrating that they were more likely to underrecover. Now we have the data, and that analysis is sort of proven out to have occurred, as was predicted by CPCNH about a year ago. And now the question of how to recover those costs But we're dealing with that now. On the right, just the graph here is showing the proxy rate in the light dotted line. So this is the rate that was advertised by Eversource over the last 3 periods. And then in the dark blue, you can see what the actual cost of service rate would have been. So for the middle and to the right periods, it's about a cent if you average those out in difference between the actual cost and what the advertised rate was. So of course, this is a problem for competitive market development. If you have these large and persistent differences between the utility's advertised rate and the actual cost underlying that rate, customers are still going to make decisions based on those rates. Customers and communities are going to make those decisions, but those prices are not an accurate reflection of the actual underlying cost. So this is, economists might call this a market distortion, and it distorts the ability of customers to make accurate and informed decisions on rates that are accurate reflections of those costs. And we see this playing out in real time in the state when you have perhaps a media outlet or a TV station presenting published rates in comparison, and you have customers or communities making decisions based upon those when, again, the rates are not accurate reflections of costs. I like the term you used earlier, Deana, in terms of the asymmetrical market. I think that applies in this case where, again, if you're a regulated entity with certain regulatory advantages, what does that mean for the fair development of a marketplace? So there are recommendations in the testimony in terms of some options to mitigate some of these effects on the competitive market. We are recommending the commission call for more frequent reporting on actual costs and revenues associated with utility default supply service, so we can better track and more accurately reconcile those under collections. And of course, we're going to be working hard to ensure these significant losses are not, shifted on to customers in the marketplace or customers with a local city and town community power program. The final thing I'll note is well, in the short term, there will be some rulings on next period rates in the sort of summer fall period. What we expect, what CPCNH is requesting, is additional proceedings to resolve some of these unanswered questions. Does this fit with our state legislative frameworks? Is this the appropriate methodology for pricing utility supply? How to recover these under collections? Some of those topics are likely to unfold in the coming fall. So I don't know if we have content on the Liberty one, but I'll just speak to, we do. Perfect. So I guess I'll pause there and then hand it off to Deana. Are you going to cover this one?
Yeah, I think Cliff and I can chat about this one.
Yes, please.
And I think, Henry, there's a couple of questions in the chat. Eversource again recently put out to its customers that rates just come from regulators, so they're already pointing the finger at the PUC ahead of the expected PR from this topic. Okay, more a comment than a question.
Just to respond to that, if I can, it is an interesting conundrum that comes from this regulatory compact, right? We have this regulatory compact. We've done this agreement where we said, okay, we can have a monopoly service for electricity distribution because it makes sense to have one company running the poles and wires. In exchange for that, you'll subject yourself to state regulation, so we can oversight over your rate setting. You can't abuse that monopoly power to extort profit from your captive customers. But it creates this dynamic where there's a constant sort of diffusion of responsibility or finger pointing, as was noted here. It's not the utility's fault, it's the regulator's fault. Or, well, it's not the regulator's fault, it's the utility's fault. So it is an interesting dynamic that rises from, heavily regulated markets like this one.
Yeah, thank you, Henry. That's helpful. So Liberty, and Liberty represents a somewhat unusual circumstance because of where it's come from in the last year or so. So you might recall last summer when they came for their rate proposal to the commission, they reported about an $8 million under collection, and part of that was exacerbated because of their forecasting. And so it kind of put the commission on guard in terms of, well, if you're not quite clear why this is such a big swing, we don't necessarily feel comfortable in approving recovery for this. We want to adjudicate it further. So they said, put half of it into a deferral account and then put the other half into your rates. the commission also said, assume that the town of Salem is not launching its community aggregation program. And at that point, it was kind of somewhat understood within the utility and the town of Salem, evidently, that there was plans for Salem to launch last fall. So anyway, the commission kind of asked them to take the higher forecast, and then because of Salem's launch, and because of the proxy price that was directed, that was underpricing the actual cost of service, it really exacerbated their undercollection. So they were essentially treading water over this past year, and that's what we learned through discovery and then through their subsequent proposal here in the last week or so. And so the rest of the case was adjudicated earlier in April, and at that point there was some agreement by the OCA, CPCNH, the Department of Energy, and even Liberty for a path forward that would, readjust and start to collect some of the outstanding balance starting May 1, so adjust their rates up to start collecting, recognizing that they had two other community aggregation programs launching in May and June, and it would be far better to start collecting some of that now than pressing it off and then continuing to grow that balance. Commission didn't act until a few days ago, right before Liberty filed its proposal. And they basically kicked the can down the road again. So now this is like the third time that the commission has said, nope, no recovery yet. We're still not sure. And meanwhile, Liberty's load has shrunk significantly. Its load was already more or less pretty small after our main launches in 2023. And then there were some other communities that launched in that interim. But in the last 6 months, they've lost like a huge chunk of their remaining load. So the confluence of factors now creates this situation, perhaps untenable situation, where now in order to start recruiting that balance, they had to propose a rate of over 21 cents. And to, I think almost everybody that kind of represented like a rate shock, like, oh, wait a minute, like this is, I think a 50%, more than a 50% increase from their supply rate this year, and like a 25% overall increase on the bill. So Cliff and I submitted testimony covering a lot of the same issues that Henry just laid out in the Eversource testimony. And we were a bit nimble because the situation was evolving and fluid. So what ended up happening was at the hearing, we proposed this sort of middle pathway that ended up being supported by the OCA, the DOE, and largely Liberty to avoid this kind of rate shock, but still allow, high enough level for Liberty to start making meaningful recovery of its under collection balance. So that number is 17.7 cents. So that we put that out there, basically everybody kind of supported that. The DOE at the beginning of the hearing, asked the commission to take administrative notice of the fact that House Bill 1733 had been signed into law that morning, but I guess hadn't been publicized yet by the governor's office. So I think there is some speculation and concern that that was intended because if we go back to that slide, the provision for enactment, it was originally 60 days after passage, but when it went to the Senate Finance Committee, they amended it to go into effect upon passage. So now that law is in effect now. So there is concern that the commission may take that provision, and again, they'd have to, notice that separately because that extraordinary circumstance was not part of, this instant docket, this proceeding. So there is concern that they may kick the can down the road yet again on Liberty's reconciliation. It's called ESAF, Energy Service Adjustment Factor. So that could, again, distort the rate, at least initially for this period. So we will continue to fight efforts to kick the can down the road further and to try to shift recovery into non-bypassable wires charges, which would be, include our customers and harm our customers and harm the market. I'll stop there because I know we're after 2, but Cliff, you may also have some additional insights.
Yeah, it seems maybe like he's okay. Yeah, I was just going to note we are over time. Maybe folks can stay on for a little bit longer as we wrap up, but we want to be cognizant of that.
Yep.
We will have a recording if you aren't able to hang out any further with us this afternoon. But why don't
And
we keep moving through maybe
yes, yeah,
the
I'll be
content
really
here.
quick, the next one. So we are expecting a decision from the PUC in this case on Friday. And then Unitil, it's a little bit less nuanced. They came in with an under collection balance for this last period, which means this last year, at about 3 million. Some of that is a little bit offset because they, I think, over collected on the RPS, so it's not, it's a little bit wonkier than the other 2 utilities. So they originally came forward with a proposal of 14.47 cents for the small customer group, including residential. And that was based on the commission's December order that said, yes, make changes to the proxy price method. So instead of doing it the way they had been doing it before, which really resulted in underpricing of actual costs across the board more times than not, just like the testimony and analysis of Samuel Golding that he conducted for CPCNH last year. And moving to a 6-month reconciliation cycle instead of once a year, they said, the day before Unitil filed its proposal, we order you to go back to the old method of forecasting the proxy rates and going back to the normal 12-month reconciliation period. So, of course, Unitil, they're not able to change all of that a day in advance, so they filed this proposal. We got to the hearing and, they said we can file another one tomorrow. It just takes more than 24 hours to do all of this. So basically, their updated proposal, it's a slight decrease in the rate for the residential class. So it went from 4.47 to 4.269. It doesn't seem like there's much controversy in that. So expect the PUC to decide on that also by this Friday. I would just warn though that, again, because we know the way they forecast the proxy rates tends to undercollect because it's not accurately pricing the true cost of supply service. This risks putting Unitil in a situation where they have a greater undercollection, or possibly they're not able to recoup the full $3 million balance that they will be accruing starting August 1. So that's that. I think the next slide is just a couple of other regulatory updates, things that we're following. The DOE has 2 rulemakings, net metering and interconnection. Net metering ones were adopted by the JL cards, the Joint Legislative Committee on Administrative Rulemakings. The interconnection rules, the CEN 1000 rules, received conditional approval. However, there's another hearing this Friday, tomorrow, on them. And then there's 2 investigations that we're monitoring and participating in. One is the nuclear generation investigation, and that's per the governor's executive order from March, which directs the Department of Energy to do this investigation and then ultimately come up with a roadmap for how New Hampshire can incorporate nuclear, into its picture in a way that's safe, compliant, cost-effective, and has stakeholder alignment. So they're having a 3-day public session next week. Cliff and I will be attending parts of that. There is a public comment session scheduled for Thursday all day, or between 9 and 3:30. So any communities that may be interested in attending and expressing their interests, concerns, voice about those matters, definitely you can find that on the Department of Energy's website, and just use this INV 2026-001 to get the information. All right, last slide I think is just upcoming events. So we have a member rate setting workshop coming up next Wednesday. All members are invited, so we'll have even more updates on the utility default service cases because we should have orders for Unitil and Liberty by then. And we will have a proposal from Eversource. Actually, later today, we should have that. And then, of course, RLAC is having its summer planning retreat. It's going to be July 24th, all day at Primex. So thank you all for joining. I'm happy to stay on a few extra minutes if there's any burning questions, but feel free to follow up with any of us. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Yeah, thank you, Deana. Thank you, Cliff. I believe Andrew hopped off, but thank you to Andrew as well and Henry. Appreciate all of your active participation in this session. Looking at the chat, Bruce Tucker had a question about if HB 1733 goes into immediate effect, does it impact the current rate dockets? I think you did speak to that, Deana, that there's a potential that that language, could be utilized as part of these dockets. Of course, we're hoping that, it's implemented in a just and reasonable way. And then I'm not seeing really, there were some other comments in the chat, but no questions necessarily. But if folks have any questions, feel free to speak up or raise your hand. Otherwise, we can close out. Okay. Hearing none, seeing none. Everyone have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Thanks,
Thanks all.
everybody. Have a good day.